Okay, hello everyone. Welcome back to the RM Karma Doctoral Students and Junior Faculty Consortium. Today we're going to be focusing on advances in data analytic techniques. And we have three amazing speakers today that will be sharing their expertise with us. But before introducing our speakers, I would like to first thank Karma and Larry Williams again for partnering with us to organize this consortium. Larry, do you want to say a few words before we start?
Yeah, that's great, Hoda. Hey, welcome everybody. For those of you who I haven't met or haven't seen, I'm Larry Williams, the Karma Director, and it is a real honor for us to be providing the technology support for this year's version of the RMD Karma Doctoral Student Junior Faculty Consortium. It's a role we've gladly filled over the past several years. I'm a big believer in the concept of what the consortium is about, and we're happy to help in any way that we can. We hope that you're having a good experience. If you've had any technology problems along the way, please let us know. We do a lot of these types of events, but sometimes things happen. So let us know what we can do to make it better. Special shout out of thanks to Ezgi, who's probably busy letting people in. She's our Karma Assistant Director who handles all the Zoom stuff and always does a great job. So thanks to Ezgi and Hoda. I've enjoyed partnering with you. And this one is particularly special because, as it turns out, as is often the case, but notably today, all three of the presenters have our Karma former or soon-to-be Karma webcast presenters, and Louis and Pierre and Tina. We're grateful for what you've done for Karma and grateful for your contributions here as well. So hope you have a great time and good luck with it all, and we'll see you at the next event. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Larry. We have three speakers today. I'm going to do an introduction and then we'll jump into the presentation. So first up, we have Dr. Karen Kohler, who is an associate professor of international business at the University of Melbourne. Her research interest is in the areas of cross-cultural management and communication and group processes. And today she will be speaking to us about how to make your coding adaptable and relevant in qualitative research. Next, we have Dr. Pierre Fiss, who is a professor of management and organization at the University of Southern California. His research mainly focuses on how meaning structures shape organizational actions. And today he will be presenting a talk about recent developments in qualitative comparative analyses. And finally, we have Dr. Louis Tay, who is an associate professor of IO psychology at Purdue University. His research mainly focuses on well-being and research methods, and today he will provide an overview of data analysis approaches for big data. Thank you, the three of you, for taking the time today to join us. I know some of you are traveling, so thank you so much for taking the time. We greatly appreciate your knowledge and expertise, so thank you. So the way we're gonna do it today is each presenter will present for about 30 minutes, and then we'll do a 10 minutes Q&A on that particular topic. Toward the end of the presentation, I'll have the chat opened up so you can start typing in your questions. And if you would like to just ask the questions directly, you can just raise your hands and I'll ask you to unmute and speak. If you don't have any questions, we'll start with our first presentation. Tina, would you like to start?
Sure, thanks, Hoda, and thanks for the nice introduction. So let me pull up my presentation first. And go into share screen. Okay, come on. So I'm trying to make it go into presentation mode. There we go. It's a little bit slow, but that's all right. So I'm just waiting for me to see my slides because I don't yet. Right now I still have a black screen, so this is not a good start. But what I'm going to talk about, so I'm going to, be hopeful that it'll show up eventually. What I want to talk about is coding practices. So from the qualitative side, I mean, coding is probably the most often used technique to analyze qualitative data. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about how to keep and make your coding adaptable and relevant to the research that you're doing. And that entails a move beyond templates, a move beyond kind of the well-trodden path of other work before us. So that's kind of, I guess, where I want to situate the innovativeness of the data analysis part. So I'm going to start off with defining what I mean by templates, and then I'm also going to talk a little bit about the methodological challenges that come from template use. So kind of why we care that people may move beyond templates if necessary. And then I'm going to talk about alternatives to coding that are not formed based on templates, so that you get a bit of an idea of the kinds of things you can be doing or could be doing if you want to get a little bit more creative and a little bit more adaptive with your coding. And I highlight in that some of the benefits for theorizing. The background is that we've had a featured topic in organizational research methods on template using qualitative research and templates of qualitative research. I put the link on the slide, but I also put the link in the chat so that you can access this directly. At the moment, until July 12th, all the papers in the featured topic are freely available, so they're open access for everybody at the moment. So if you want to kind of follow up on some of the papers that I'm mentioning in this talk, feel free to do so. You could do that via the link, and then of course afterwards they're going to be available through your organization and library if they have a subscription for ORM. The purpose of the feature topic was that we really kind of see, especially some of us who are editors and you know, see a lot of qualitative work that doesn't get published. We saw really quite a worrying trend that people seem to be using templates in a kind of mindless way. So they kind of apply them and they really don't fit, or they apply them in ways that are not really adapted to the specific studies that they're doing. So we wanted to highlight, you know, what some of the issues are with that. But rather than making this an exchange of opinions between researchers, we really wanted to make sure that we do a conceptual and empirical evaluation of kind of what do these practices do that is harmful for the conduct of qualitative research, and then of course really urged the authors in the feature topics to come up with real alternatives. So I can highly recommend reading, I think provide the next steps that we're going to see in how people approach data collection and data analysis over time. So that's just as a little bit of a background. So now, what do I mean by templates? So we define templates in our feature topic as systematic, simplified, and repeatable approaches to data collection, and analysis and interpretation, and sometimes even the writing up of the work. And they're legitimized and standardized through enactments. So basically through repeated publication, especially when they're published in top-ranked journals. And more than that, often there are some normative pressures that come from key gatekeepers to keep using those templates. So in short, kind of they're protocolized ways of conducting and analyzing qualitative data. Now, what that means practically, if you're thinking about, well, am I using a template? When am I using a template? So what that practically means is that if you start a research project and you look for example papers in the top journals, as many of us would do, you might feel encouraged, let me put it this way, to follow the structure and the tables, like for example, data presentation tables that other people have used in their work. Because, you know, this work has got published, so clearly that must be the way to do it. So if you're one of those people who basically say, okay, so-and-so has recently published an article, they use this structure to present their data, they use that kind of structure and kind of explanation in their method section, I'm going to do the same. That's essentially template use. That doesn't have to be negative from the outset, but it's very likely that your study varies quite a bit or differs quite a bit from another study that's been published. Even just in the fact that probably what you're doing and what the authors have done in their respective work that you're copying is probably not aligned 100%. A lot of things that authors do don't actually make it into the method section, not because they're hiding it, but because there just isn't enough space to put everything. So there's probably a lot that they've done that you're not doing. So this kind of template use has a few issues attached to it that kind of revolve around not being able to talk about everything you've actually done. So we did an empirical study for our paper in the featured topic, and we interviewed people at varying stages of their career and also at varying levels of expertise with qualitative work, because we wanted to find out, why do people use templates, or why they stay away from templates, why they probably criticize them when they're being reviewers on papers that you're using. So some of the core themes that we found are basically diametrical. So they're opposite ends of continua. And I'm going to talk through some of the core concerns and core reasons why people use templates over time. So especially for novice qualitative research, so people who haven't been trained formally in qualitative methods or who use them for the very first time, templates, so templated approach that outlines certain steps, can often provide a sense of structure. So they can provide a sense of guidance, which helps a new researcher be less overwhelmed by the whole process. It also can sometimes help organize your thoughts, right? It's a kind of a first step of analyzing your data that may give you some guidance as to how to do this. Now, at the same time, the more experienced qualitative researchers feel quite restricted by following a template. And so there are constraints about how data analysis and presentation are supposed to go if you follow the template, or if you're pushed to follow the template by a reviewer. And it often can lead to premature conclusions. So a lot of times when you use a template, you're trying to emulate a certain structure, and that structure may not fit with your data. It may also not actually be the last step that your data analysis needs. It might have just been the last step that somebody else's data analysis needed. So it can lead basically to you ending your data analysis a little bit too early. So here are some of the quotes from our interviews that highlight that. So we had people who basically say that it helps them be more structured, keep a hand on the guardrails, like basically feel that they have some guidance, and that templates help them to think through the data. But a lot of our other more experienced qualitative interviewees felt like that they should really only be the starting point for research, as a way to potentially screen your data at the beginning, just to engage with your data a little bit more. And they often said it's the very first step out of about 850 steps. So, and that's often the problem. So somebody who's new and follows the template and sees, like reproduces a particular structure, they think that's all they need to do. They think that that's the outcome that they're trying to achieve, when it's really often only the very first step. So that's kind of our structure restriction tension. Other issues relate to the fact that templates create a sort of convention, a standardized language, which again can be perceived as very positive by people, especially if they're struggling with all of the variety of qualitative methods that are out there. There's a lot of variability, and there are a lot of different epistemological and ontological traditions that people need to learn about. And yet at the same time, the more experienced researchers feel that in the same breath, there's a lack of innovativeness. So it curtails kind of what people can do within the template. The template often doesn't provide for a lot of variation or a lot of adaptation. Part of that is really kind of a historical lens. So one of our interviews explained this really well, basically saying that, when qualitative research was first introduced into management research, the type of research had pretty low legitimacy. So this creation of a standardized way of doing things was quite important to gain legitimacy. But it's now come to a point where basically that standardized way of doing things prevents us from discovering new things, from doing things in ways that actually are more conducive to studying novel topics. And so we need to let go of some of that convention to really rediscover the interesting bits and the power of the qualitative method itself. The third theme is kind of legitimization versus obscuration. So one of the very interesting things that we thought is that, of course, templates look like they give your work legitimacy. So a lot of people look for them or look to them for that kind of the one right way to do things. So if I've done it following the template, then I must be right. I must be doing things right. and the reviewers should believe me that I've done this right because I followed an accepted template. However, the more experienced reviewers actually think that the template hides what people have actually done. So the more experienced reviewer thinks that the shorthand of the template basically obscures what has really gone on in the research. And so they often doubt more than anything what the researchers have done, especially if they don't spend a lot of time explaining how they filled in the template, how they basically did their research. So we see this now in the review process a lot, where in previous years, reviewers might have pushed for the template. They might have kind of asked authors to say, okay, if you provide me with, a filled out data structure in a certain way, then it's going to be more credible. And so people have done this, authors have done this, but now it swings the other way. So the pendulum is really kind of going the other way. If you're using a template, you might often actually be asked to really explain what you've done and not just use the template. And the whole idea here being that you need to leave that trail of breadcrumbs. So people need to understand how you move from your raw data to your theory, to what you built, the conclusions that you drew from it. I'm not going to go through all of the quotes, by the way, in so much detail. I'm summarizing them. You have them all in the paper that you can access online. All right, lastly, it's about instrumentality versus craft. So a lot of people employ templates because an instrumental way to get published, right? So if I follow the templates, it must get published, because or you might get fewer challenges in the review process because reviewers might believe you more. So oftentimes people use it because they think it's a quicker way. It's a more efficient way to go through with your qualitative study. But the more experienced reviewers, or the more experienced qualitative researchers we had, highlighted that this comes with an erosion of the craft. So it comes with a narrowing of acceptable approaches. It comes with a narrowing, and that often doesn't quite work with certain approaches within qualitative work. And so it erodes the quality of those approaches and erodes the actual craft that's necessary to carry out a well conducted qualitative piece of research. So some of those concerns were pretty strong in terms of saying that, this kind of idea of using shortcuts, of speeding up the process, is actually kind of opposite to what qualitative research needs, good qualitative in-depth research needs. All right, and actually I think, going through those tensions, when I talked to quite a few of my quantitative colleagues, they would actually agree to most of them being applicable to quantitative research as well, right? So, I mean, you think about the shortcuts, there are lots of people who want to find lots of shortcuts, and sometimes that's not the best way to go. All right, so what I want to highlight here, so I want to go forward now and switch over to what are some of the alternatives to using templates. And I just highlighted here the papers that we have in the feature topic with their respective titles. And you already see from the title some of the core themes that the papers are covering. I'm not going to go through all of those papers. I picked 3 as exemplars to just kind of showcase the kinds of things that they're suggesting you could be doing differently. But I wanted to at least present them all here so that you have an idea, and maybe like something like ethnography is your thing. So you know that there's a paper there that you could refer to that directly relates to what you're currently doing or interested in. So the first paper I want to highlight is the paper in the feature topic by Pratt et al. And so they describe basically the coding process as a process of analytical moves. So it shouldn't be a straightforward process in the sense that you just basically follow the steps like a recipe that somebody has outlined before you. Rather, you should think about the fact that the coding itself, the data analysis process, is actually a process of several moves that you're making. And each move should be informed by, of course, what you found in the move before it. And so they're calling this methodological bricolage. So it's a combining of different analytical moves for the purpose of solving specific problems in your data analysis or in your data and in your thinking. And so you're really basically coming to an effective arrangement of analytical moves that then exhibits trustworthiness that you can present in your paper, write up in your paper to present to your reviewers. Bricoleurs, so people who do bricolage, really need 3 abilities. So the first is cobble things together. The second is understanding and engaging in it with available resources. And then the third is to use a combination of analytical moves that is particularly well suited to what you're doing with your data. So to solve the problem of analysis in your data. And so to give a couple of examples for this, so coupling things together means that you need to actually be able to combine different analytical techniques, which of course means that you need to be competent in qualitative research methods. You need to have a large toolbox from which to pull, knowing different analytical techniques, right? It's not good enough to just have learned one specific step approach to analysis. You need to know a couple of them so that you can pull from different types of techniques to really optimally adjust that to your data collection. And that kind of brings in that second point of really understanding and engaging with your available resources. And in the end, basically, to arrive at a well thought through combination of these different techniques. So they define, of course, they define 3 definitions of trust. I mean, that's not their definition. They used Meyer et al.'s framework for trust. So the 3 important components here is that you're competent enough basically to know the different analytical techniques and how to combine them. But you also need integrity. So you also need to know which techniques cannot be combined because they're built on different epistemological principles, for example. Not all techniques are based on the same assumptions. And so it's really important to also understand what assumptions your analytical techniques are built on in the first place. I'll return to that point with the next paper that I'm going to discuss. And lastly, you have to be benevolent to your data. So what that means is that you need to focus on making sure that you're not, as they call it, violate, the experience of their informants. So in a way, you're not trying to misrepresent what your informants have said. You actually want to make sure that you find a fair description of what's going on that takes the voice of the informants into account, so the voice of your interviewees or the people you observed or whatever. So the idea here being, don't think of data analysis. So in a bricolage approach, you don't think of data analysis as finding one data analysis approach and follow this from beginning to end. So for example, if you do grounded theory, you don't just go out and say, okay, I'm just going to do Strauss and Corbin from beginning to end, and I try to follow every single step that they suggest, or I'm going to go out and do a Gioia grid exactly the way that Gioia has put out in his 2013 paper, but rather that you think about what are the analytical moves that make sense for the data that I'm collecting. So what are the analytical moves? And all of those templates can be part of those analytical moves, but they probably won't be the only thing that you're looking at. Because it's very likely that your sample, that your research question, that the form of your data, so the modality, might actually require different things because they may differ from those original data. So in a bricolage approach, you mix and match, but the mixing and matching has to be done expertly. So it has to be done with a thorough rationale for why these things can be combined and why it helps you analyze your data with a sense cards theory. And so that creates rigor. So the Harley and Cornelissen paper has a very good discussion of what actually rigor means, and that is not just carrying out an approach exactly as somebody else has described it, but rather find a very good fit between the research question, the methods that you choose, and the conclusions that you draw from those methods. So that's kind of the first paper that I want to highlight, and it flows quite nicely into the second paper. So in the Mesbou's paper in the featured topic, they're taking an approach to kind of figuring out, is there an alternative to one of the most often used techniques for grounded theory? And so in a way, one of the most often used that we see in journal articles at the moment is the Gioia grid. And so that has a very specific data structure that got suggested, although Gioia and the team around themselves has said multiple times, please don't use this indiscriminately all the time. This is a suggestion, it's what worked for us. Please feel free to adapt how it works for you. But people quite often use it just in the same way, very templamatic as Gioia did. And so the Mesbou et al. Basically were highlighting the underlying assumptions on which the Gioia grid is built, namely a very naturalistic approach to data analysis. And so that means that it's built predominantly on what people have said, less an interpretive approach. So they suggest an alternative, namely through hermeneutics. And so they suggest a couple of different questions that people can ask to become more interpretive and to become more critical, to enable them to theorize. So highlighting this, they have a pretty good table. So I just copied the table because I think that's the best way to highlight this. They identify a couple of interpretive challenges with regard to what you might try to do in your data, what you might try to do in your study, such as, interpreting subjective field data. And then they provide you with the kind of heuristic thought patterns that you might want to think about as you're going through the data. So what's really going on here, right? Could you be skeptical towards specific aspects of your data? And then they give you probing questions that you could use. So you could put that to your data as you're doing your analyses to figure out what's going on, right? So you're using basically those questions to guide your coding. So for example, if you take that third question here, are the participants social, cultural, historical, context critical? In your coding, you could look specifically for social, historical, or cultural context, right? You could code towards that. You could look for incidents where culture might come up or historical events might be referenced by your interviewees. And then you analyze them in particular with regard to their effect on the relationships and on the constructs that you're interested in. And they have a couple more, right? So I'm not going to go through this again in depth, but what this allows you to do as an alternative approach is that you are asking yourself alternative questions. So you move away from what have participants said? How can I summarize what participants have said into larger categories? How can I maybe figure out how those categories are related to each other? So kind of a naturalistic description of what's going on. And you move more towards what does this really all mean? So I can have a description of what my participants have said, but where is what they've said coming from? What are some of the underlying structural factors, contextual factors, maybe power, that creates what the participants are experiencing, and hence then of course creates what they're telling me as the interviewer, right? So where is this all coming from? And to some degree, we sometimes need to be a bit skeptical potentially, because we can't assume that our informants are telling us everything and that they're basically trustworthy of us all the time. So we also sometimes need to ask, okay, maybe there are some things that I haven't been told. And how could that change my findings, right? So maybe there are things going on that I haven't quite understood yet. So this is really useful, I think, as a general starting point as well, especially if the research topic that you're exploring deserves a more critical stance and a more critical evaluation of what might be. And then finally, I wanted to highlight the Locke paper, the Locke, Feldman, Golden-Biddle paper. And they specifically look at coding as an analytical practice, especially as an iterative process. So in their view, codes are inherently unstable. So oftentimes when we look at coding and coding descriptions in published papers, the issue can quickly become that it looks like somebody coded and then they never recoded the data. They never reinterpreted the data after they've done a lot of coding and potentially have learned a lot more about the meaning, the underlying meaning of those codes. Locke et al. Are suggesting, no, the codes need to be inherently unstable. They should be changing over time. They should be refined over time. And it's really this iterative nature of the data collection that brings you to theorizing, not the coding per se, the very mechanistic templated coding. So you cannot think of coding as a sequence. And the problem with templates is often that they portray coding like a sequence. So they don't tell you about all the iterative steps. They don't show you multiple coding steps along the way. They just show you the final solution as if that has always existed like that. And so basically the idea here being you want to go through this process multiple times. You want to iterate. You want to actually also take note of the change that happens in your meaning making of the codes. Oops, don't know what that is, sorry. How do I get out of this? Okay. They allow us to see a couple of different coding practices here. And they call them coding moments. They're actually similar to what Brett et al. Call analytical moves, although the coding moments here also have a temporal component in the sense that basically you may have several moments throughout your data analysis, and they may actually be iterative. Well, they have to be iterative with themselves, but the actual behavior, so the coding actions might be different. So you could be drawing on previous literature to try and determine what's going on in my data. What am I seeing here? You could also code from bottom up, right? That's a different coding approach to just kind of engage with the data directly. You could generate throughout your coding process different types of coding procedures, so different analytical moves, as Brett et al. Talk about it. So you could have lists versus cases versus graphical depictions. So you can use all of those things, and then you may actually go back to more coding directly in the data. So it's that iterative nature here that gives you the theoretical refinement over time. And this last step of putting the patterns together is really important. So you're looking at patterns across data. You're looking at patterns across, for example, different groups in your sample or different time periods. And so it's that often that gives you an insight into what's going on and why it's happening. They provide in their paper a couple of really strong examples. So they take example papers and go through their description in the method section to highlight what those papers have done at what times. And they see that papers use very different coding moments in very different orders. So it's not prescribed that you have to follow a particular order. And I think this particular combination is, so this particular type of data representation, the table here, might actually be something that people want to use going forward as a way to show the kind of coding moments that they were going through and the kind of analytical moves that they've gone through throughout their paper. So instead of having, of course, somebody else's paper here described in terms of what they do, we could think about describing, well, I started with this, which is, maybe an organizing to code or maybe a data engagement. I then noticed from that X. What I noticed made me go to do Y, the next step. And so as you're describing this, a reviewer or reader is very much able to find out what you've actually done. And it creates transparency. It creates legitimacy because the reader actually understands why you've done those things. But it also creates a structured process, like that trail of breadcrumbs I was referring to earlier that a reviewer was really concerned about. It creates a trail of breadcrumbs for the reader to understand how did they go from the raw data, from their insight, and how did they form their insights to arrive at their conclusions and ultimately at the theorizing. So I can highly recommend this paper if you're doing coding very often to really get some good insights into what kind of coding approaches are common and how could I display them. All right, so this is pretty much what I wanted to cover. I wanted to just highlight as a summary, the really beneficial approaches that you can take away from some of these papers are really how to do bricolage, how to embrace the diversity of different approaches that are out there without going down the road of following a cookie cutter recipe that may not actually fit your data. The transparency has to be about what and why you've done it. Okay, so you have to explain both, not just explain what you've done, but actually why you've done this and why this makes an effective arrangement of analytical moves. And that makes your decisions visible to the researcher, which buys you trustworthiness, which buys you credibility and legitimacy. So we don't want you to treat the papers here as the next set of templates that you might want to use, but rather as another expansion of your toolbox, right? So to really kind of get some ideas of what you could be doing, and then really think about critically about your data and your study and say, okay, I can pull from here, I can pull from there because it fits. All right, so that's what I wanted to share. And I know that Hoda has opened the chat. Brief last mention, we do have a set of master classes on those papers. So if you really want to learn more about them, those master classes at the Academy of Management are going to focus on exactly what you can take from the papers forward. They're not a presentation of each of the papers, they're an explanation of specific practices that you can apply in the future in your own work. So if you find that useful, please join us. It's hybrid interactive at AOM. That means we can both accommodate people in person and virtually. All right, so I'm going to stop share here and see what questions we have. Make sure that we move on in time.
Thank you so much, Tina. That was a great presentation and a lot of great resources for those of us who are doing qualitative research to consider. So I just opened up the chat. So if you have any questions, you can just type it up, or you can just raise your hand to, so I can get here. Do you want to ask a question yourself?
Yeah, I would love to. Tina, I thought this was really useful. And I had read the issue and I really liked it. When you started, I was sort of thinking, what's the difference between templates and best practices? But the more you were talking about it, my thinking actually shifted. And I was thinking, what of the things that you talked about does not apply to quantitative social science as well? Because quite frankly, I was going through all the different things, problematizing your data, being skeptical towards it, skepticism towards theoretical interpretations, interrogating the theory, how might I be wrong? I was literally kind of thinking, I wasn't able to really come up with anything that, in my view, doesn't apply to quantitatively done social science as well. So,
and I fully agree. Like we set out to create something that could apply actually to both, right? So it's just that because we see this particular issue discussed at the moment pretty hotly in qualitative work, because there are so many pressures on complying, and it's less accepted yet at this point. I think in quantitative research, we see a lot of those templates being very readily accepted. And as you said, you already brought up the best practice kind of papers that are, I think, quite often resulting in templated use of those best practices, even though some of them don't apply. So we are fully happy for people to take this and say, well, actually, this all applies in quantitative work as well. So let's potentially criticize some of the way that we're using quantitative techniques, or that people are using quantitative techniques at this point.
Right.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
Awesome. So does anyone have any question that they want to ask?
And by the way, if nobody has questions right now, that's totally fine. I put my email address down, and you probably have that somewhere. If you have a question after the fact, just send it through. Happy to respond to things that pop into your mind after we've concluded the session. That always happens to me.
Thank you so much. Well, we have one question. How do some of the more traditional qualitative scholars, Eisenhardt and Gioia, think about some of the methods you discussed today?
Yep. Well, actually, you can find out, because Denny Gioia did a debate, or curated a debate in Journal Management Inquiry, where he talks about how he views the papers published in the feature topic. And the interesting part, I think, there is that in some of his own publications over time, so talking about his method and how his method is applied, as I mentioned earlier, he points out quite often that the way that he suggested to use this method is often abused, is often misused and misapplied to research where it doesn't fit. So he doesn't disagree with that part. He disagrees with other components of it. And I think he describes that in this paper in Journal Management Inquiry. And the good thing is you have a lot of commentaries after that that actually reflect on his reflection. So I don't want to repeat all of that, because there are lots of varied views. There are lots of divergent views there as well. And I think it's well worth reading them to also get a bit of an idea. Research methods themselves, we're a discipline that has debate. So research methods publications are also not, the one true way of doing things. We're making suggestions of what we think is a potentially useful way to do certain things. That doesn't mean they can't be debated. That doesn't mean that practices shouldn't change over time. So I see research methods as an acted practice, rather than, the final answer to a particular problem. And so I think you get that from that debate, that there are lots of divergent views, and lots of divergent views that are very well grounded in research methods literature. They're not just opinions. So have a look at that, because that should inform how you're thinking about defending your own research methods applications.
So a question that came to my mind in terms of these divergent views in the review process, when you have like different reviewers with different viewpoints, do you have any recommendations on how we can actually handle those divergent viewpoints?
Well, I mean, so first and foremost, you should know why you've done what you've done, right? So, I mean, if you start out a very good reason for the steps that you've taken, methodological reasons, I mean, sometimes they're practical reasons and they're valid too, but, if you start out with, what Mike Pratt suggested, with a competent application that takes into account, epistemological traditions and all of that, and you have that, and you've made a good effort at describing those in the paper, you actually shouldn't get too many divergent reviews, right? If you do, the problem might often be in not describing this particularly well. So then it becomes your job to really explain to the reviewers a lot better what your thinking was behind all of this. Now, if the divergent views come from you not having had particularly good reasons for doing this in the first place, that's a little bit harder to fix. So in a way, sometimes it results in you actually reanalyzing your data or providing a better account of, why what you're doing might be legitimate. And then that goes into your explanation. So I think it kind of depends on what the problem is that the reviewers are grappling with, right?
Perfect. Thank you so much. So if no one else has any question, we can actually, at the end, if we have time, we could, circle back if you have any additional question. You can ask them at then. If not, we'll go to our next speaker, Dr. Fest. Would you like to start?
Sure, Hoda. I'm happy to. And just to follow up, so I'll be going until 20 minutes past. Is that right? So to make sure Louis has enough time. So let me try to do that.
We are kind of flexible, but it's maybe 30 minutes. We can shorten a little bit the discussion afterwards. So just whatever that works for your presentation.
Sure. Okay. All right. Let me share my screen then.
Perfect.
All right. Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Pierre Fiss from USC. The Research Methods Division asked me to speak a bit about set analytics and qualitative comparative analysis. About myself, I come from the quantitative side. I only started publishing qualitative work when my doctoral students pulled me in that. So these were ethnographers that, yes, as often happens, sort of as your doctoral students pull you in different directions. So, but really, for the most part, I'm a macro/quantitative researcher, and I'll talk a little bit about, so therefore I'll talk about QCA and set analytics. Set analytics, the bigger tent QCA is one of the set analytic approaches, the most dominant one, arguably. There's a couple of other ones, including CNA, but so I'll give you a few. Well, let me sort of share a few thoughts about that. The reason I think set analytic approaches in QCA have been more prevalent lately has been that, well, really, if you think about strategic management in particular, sort of which is where a lot of my work is, organization theory and strategic management, configurational thinking is arguably really prevalent, right? Many of us think about firms as configurations, so complex systems of interdependent characteristics. If you think about theories like the research-based view, they've long recognized that there's often there are research bundles rather than individual success factors. And, the same kind of arguments that they're usually configurations of elements. I mean, they also pervade the literature in corporate governance, human research management, arguably. If you think of Dan Levinson's work on complexity theory, entrepreneurship, really the creation of new configurations, all business systems and business model literature is all configurational. So configurations arguably are really central, I think, to much of what many of us do, at least. They are typically marked by causal complexity or complex causal processes. When you have causal complexity, so no single cause may be either necessary or sufficient, and you often have different recipes, so different configurations of elements that jointly bring about an outcome. So Charles Reagan talks about that as multiple conjunctual causation, if you're familiar with Mackey's work. These are inus causes, right? Causes that are insufficient but necessary components of these recipes. And those recipes are unnecessary but sufficient for the outcome. So if you think about example, the matchbox combination. The max is an Inus condition by itself. It's insufficient, but it's a necessary component of that matchbox combination to light a fire. But it's unnecessary because there's a different path. You could also use a flamethrower, for instance. But that path, matchbox, is sufficient for the outcome. So the match is an Inus condition, and Inus conditions, in my view, are how most things work, for that matter. So, but Inus conditions are kind of tricky, because if you actually believe that the world is kind of causally complex and there's a lot of Inus causes, as I do for that matter, then correlations are often kind of not the best thing to get at recipes. They're the most powerful thing that we have in order to get at the unique contribution, holding everything else constant. But the issue is often, I think, we're not necessarily interested in holding everything else constant, because it's very difficult to do so, not just methodologically, but theoretically. It's not really meaningful. Like if you want to make a cake, for instance, and you have a recipe, what's the point of sort of looking at the unique contribution of flour in achieving a good tasting cake, right? You want rather a balance, a recipe, a configuration of flour. It's not about the coefficient for flour as much as it is for, what are the different equifinal configurations. So you get the argument. Okay, so the main point I'm making, if that causal complexity is the rule and not the exception, then a lot of correlational tools may really not provide the kind of insight that you would want. And the alternative I'm going to talk about, some of you may be familiar with it. I'm going to assume for now that many of you are not, is our set analytic methods, such as qualitative comparative analyses. QCA is really not new anymore. Charles Reagan created it some 35 years ago. The comparative method was published in 1987. Some of its main foundations are that it uses cases as combinations of attributes, and it's particularly useful for situations where causality is complex and equifinal. And it uses crisp and fuzzy sets and Boolean algebra, as opposed to, of course, correlation analysis uses linear algebra. So it's a very different kind of approach for that matter. A few points about it. It sort of lies halfway between the qualitative and the quantitative approach. At least the traditional form of it does. It used to be focused on small n situations of like 30, 25, 30 cases where you have not enough statistical power to use any correlational tools, and not it's too complex, on the other hand, to do it in your head. If I have like 30 cases and 4 or 5 things in the case that matter, I can't do that in my head. So it provided a rigorous way to do that. I already mentioned it uses Boolean algebra rather than correlational methods. It can handle situations of causal complexity, can be used for small or medium n situation as well as for large n. I'm working with a colleague right now. We're working with LinkedIn data where you have millions of observations. So you can use it really for small and large n situations. Things change when you get to the large n world a bit, but much of it can be preserved. It's useful for teasing out what is necessary or sufficient for bringing about an outcome. Note again that correlations aren't really meant to get at sufficiency without necessity or necessity without sufficiency. Yeah, correlations are powerful tools, but they're just not good for doing that. It's particularly good, again, for equifinality and complex causality with multiple contingencies. So set analytic methods, you may have seen them increasingly in management. There's a growing community, and I'll point out that in North America, we ran the first AQUA, the annual QCA conference of the Americas in Houston this year. We'll bring it for 2023 to USC, so it'll be in March next year. If you're interested in that, look at the announcements. They'll go out on the Compass network. Compass is the clearinghouse for all things set analytic. There's a variety of new conference symposia, methods, retreats. Actually, this morning, I finished teaching a 5-day course on QCA for GSERM, the Global School of Empirical Research Methods, which is really a good school. You may be familiar with that as well. There's a lot of receptiveness these days, I think, and QCA studies have been published in really all the top management journals, including ASQ, AMJ, or Org Science, SMJ, Org Studies, ORM, all those ones, JBV, JIPS, and so forth. There's a lot of development these days. If you want to get into QCA, the easiest way is the FSQCA package, but the more advanced one is the R package. If you're an R user, you're familiar with R, it's easy to enter, but there's also a graphical user interface that you can use. There's a number of improved new measures and new ways of presenting results. But all of that is fairly abstract, so I'll try to make this a little more concrete in a moment, and I promise to talk a bit about recent developments in set analytics, and I get to that in a moment. I'll point out one more thing, which is a 2017 piece that Vilmos Pisanji and a couple of co-authors, including me, published in the Journal of Management. I'm bringing it up because I think it will provide sort of an overview of what we view as a neo-configurational perspective, that is sort of a perspective on configurational theory. You had sort of the first wave, those were the typologies of like Blau or Mars and Snow. Then we sort of suggest in the 90s, you had a second wave where people were primarily using cluster analysis and interaction terms and deviation scores to get at configurations. You know, Alan Meyer did Catch and Harold Doty come to mind for that. But we think this is sort of a new version of configurational research, and it's based on, you know, causal complexity, causal asymmetry, sets, Boolean algebra, and sort of that's obviously sort of what I want to talk about here. All right, so I promised to talk about recent advances in set analytic methods. Okay, so I'm going to talk particularly about well, not this one, sorry, but set analytics and set coincidence. And I do that for, and the context in which I'm going to do this is a 27 book Charles Reagan and I published. I know poverty isn't always something that management research will work at, but I think you'll see the methodological implications pretty quickly. We're using set coincidence, which I'll explain in a moment. But we're using it on a data set that was really well analyzed to kind of show the value. In essence, what we wanted to do was to show what can a set analytic approach provide above and beyond the correlational approach. So we first reproduce correlational findings, and then we use the set analytic approach to kind of show, hey, these are the things to which a correlational analysis is actually blind. These are models we rebuilt from, you may be familiar with the bell curve. Two conservative scholars, Herrenstein and Murray, published it in 1994. In 1995, sociologists at Berkeley used the same data, the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, to publish a refutation using the same data. Again, you know, that was called inequality by design. The outcome was who ends up out of poverty. And I'm not going to explain these regression models here. All I want to kind of point out to you, if you want to look at them, you know, they're all the information about the book is on my website. The main point I'm making is they were analyzing who ends up out of poverty among whites and blacks in the United States, okay? And if you look at the regression models, then it turns out blacks and whites really look very much the same. So for instance, look at the black sample here. So you have test scores, and the more of the control variables you put in, sort of the less important they are. But the other thing is typical that you would expect. Family income here, right, is significant across the negative in the sense that that if family income is high, you're not going to be in poverty as likely. If you go towards the next slide here, if you look at things like being a man, male, makes it less likely you're in poverty. Having kids, more likely you're in poverty. Being married, you know, less likely. Married man, interaction term for that one. So really, and the main thing here, if you look at the education, all the variables for education mean, you know, you're going to be less likely to be in poverty. All that stuff kind of. But the funny thing is, blacks and whites in this correlational analysis really look very much the same. You have the same pattern for blacks and whites. Now we know essentially sort of from lived experience that in the United States, that's not exactly true. So, well, what can a set analytic approach sort of do beyond that? And what we're trying to do here is sort of to capture the asymmetry of outcomes here. And to some extent, you know, something like being out of poverty has what you might call causal asymmetry. Nobody typically intentionally tries to be in poverty, okay? Usually sort of people try to avoid poverty. So, and I think that actually matters. So my point is set analytic methods offer a non-correlational way to capture the causal structure leading to these kind of outcomes. And set coincidence focuses on the degree to which two sets overlap, meaning how far two sets are actually one and the same. Sets, similar to variables, we're going to build them based on variables here, but they are not variables, they are sets. And set coincidence is just the number of cases at a set intersection over the number of cases in the union. So if you think about it this way, here you have two sets A and B, using Venn diagrams. Here you have set intersection, right here. It's a proportion, what's at the intersection over the union of two sets. And here you have low set coincidence. And then here, down here you have high set coincidence, meaning set intersection, the area here that is part of both sets, is almost fully covered by the union of both sets, right? You know, almost fully covers the union there. So Set coincidence is actually kind of interesting because at first glance, you might think that set coincidence is sort of roughly the same as correlation. Actually, it is not. It turns out it works somewhat differently. It's asymmetrical, and therefore it's sensitive to how you actually specify your question. So if you think about the following table here, let's say sort of the coincidence of opposes reform and being Republicans. I'm using a very simple example here, just a simple 2 by 2. Okay, so opposes reform, the intersection lies here. 250 have both characteristics. They oppose reform and they're Republican. Now, said intersection, coincidence is the intersection over the union. So it's the intersection 250 over the union, which would be those 250 plus everybody's Republican, those 50, and everybody who opposes reform, which is those 50. So it's 250 over 250 plus 50 plus 50. It's 250 over 350, so 0.71. In other words, those who oppose reform and those who are Republican coincide at a proportion of 0.71. Okay. Now, if you want to look at now supports reform and Democrat, it would be those 100 cases here of membership in both of those sets over the union, which is 100 over 100 plus 50 plus 50, which is 100 over 200. So the coincidence over sort of these two things, right, is quite different. It's only about 0.5 for those two. Notice that you won't be able to get at that if you look at the correlation between those two variables. You would only get one coefficient. But as you can see, sort of, it's different. Republicans, or those who oppose reform, have a much higher set coincidence than Democrats who support reform. And that's going to get interesting when we look at the coincidence of advantages versus disadvantages. Now, for now, stick with me with this example of poverty, but you can already see how this might apply to things such as who gets funding from venture capital once you layer advantages on top of each other. Or, for instance, how do we, what recipes do men and women sort of use to combine to achieve, become executives? Who becomes a CEO, for instance? And what are the pathways to top executive status? Or how do we promote and retain women if you're a high-tech firm? Just some examples. So, all right, so one more point about this. It's interesting because you can have strong set coincidence, but as variables, you only see weak correlation. So for instance, let's look at this one here. You have a situation of parental income, so advantage of having medium to high parental income versus medium to high test scores. And in this table, so this is data, so like 500 of those respondents actually combine both advantages. So 500 have those high test scores and at the same time, medium to high income. So the set coincidence is 500 over 500 plus 100, and 100 is 500 over 700, 0.714. But if you look at the correlation between those two variables, it's actually only 0.167. Okay, so my point here is, if you look at correlations, you wouldn't see that people who have one advantage are almost the same people who have two advantages. Okay, that's different from what you see in the correlation. From a correlation point of view, there isn't much going on here. From a set analytic point of view, there is actually a high level of confounding. And if you think about this level of confounding, well, you know correlations are not that good with confounding. If you have a lot of confounding, you have high multicollinearity, and you don't want that. So, all right, let me keep going here. So, right, so what does it mean if you want to study social inequality or things like getting venture capital funding or who ends up in executive position? Well, the point here is that if you have a Matthew principle, advantages strongly coinciding and disadvantages don't, then really you want to kind of focus on the advantages. And if disadvantages coincide strongly and advantages don't, or at least if they don't coincide as strongly, then the implication is we may really want to try to kind of avoid these downward spirals where you have people live in, whatever bad neighborhoods, send the kids to worse schools, less likely to have not low-income parents, less likely to have educated parents, less likely to be educated themselves. You can see how these advantages and disadvantages in case sort of layer on top and reinforce each other. And I think the same would be true for executive teams, who come from an Ivy League degree background, you are have venture capital backing or, already got mentoring, maybe you're part of an accelerator, those advantages probably also combine and make a difference there. So, all right. So we use this on the same data that I showed you earlier, which is the data from the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth. And the first question was, which are stronger, coinciding advantages or coinciding disadvantages? So, and the advantages we look at are all listed down here. Not low parental income, meaning sort of your parents are not poor. Not low test scores, kind of the armed forces qualification test, when you took that, you didn't score very low. Being educated yourself or having educated parents. The disadvantages are slightly different. Having low parental income, low test scores, not being educated yourself, and not having educated parents. So, and the table kind of shows you this broken down by 4 subgroups: black females, black males, white females, white males. And remember, in the correlational analysis, blacks and whites look really the same. All the coefficients that were significant for whites were also significant for blacks. So now let's look here. Combination of not low parental income, not low test scores, okay, coincides. This is set coincidence scores at a rate of about 0.49 for black females, 0.82. For whites, almost twice the size. So coincidence for whites is much, much higher for these advantages. For disadvantages, low parental income and low test scores, again, 0.46, 0.45 for black females and black males. So they coincide at immediate levels, medium levels. For white females and white males, disadvantages coincide much less than they do for blacks. The same would be true if we look at these other combinations between not low test scores and education. Again, much higher disadvantage for whites than blacks, and lower for the disadvantages, right? 0.259, 0.86. And lastly, not low parental income, parental education. Again, medium scores here, advantages and disadvantages. But advantages tend to be much higher, coincide at a higher rate, and disadvantages coincide at a lower rate. Notice again that you can't get correlations again in these. You have to use set coincidence to actually do this. And the point here is advantages tend to coincide more than disadvantages, and there's a really striking racial differences. Whites enjoy stronger coinciding advantages and have very low levels of coinciding disadvantages relative to blacks. All right, so second question. Sorry, let me keep going forward here. How strongly do multiple advantages coincide? This is when you begin layering these different advantages on top of each other. And you see, for black females, they start about 0.49. For 2 advantages, for 3 advantages, it goes down. For 4 advantages, once again, it goes down. You would expect it to decrease because you're layering sets on top of each other, right? So it's set coincidence is always going to go down. The same is true for black males. But look again at the differences in these values for white females and white males. You know, sort of even the full coincidence of 4 different sets here, 4 different advantages for white females is still higher. The same is true for white males, still higher than sort of just 2 advantages for black females. So again, the racial differences are striking, yet the correlational analysis doesn't show it to us. Well, just to prove that to you, let me sort of show you this one here. So I told you correlations and coincidence scores actually don't agree. Well, do they or not? Let's take a look together. So I want you to take a look right now sort of at the average side, at the average correlation here. That's this score here. So these are all the different sets here. And the average correlation between for white males is about 0.347. White females, 0.324. Black males, 0.321. Black females, 0.383. Really the same number. Correlation looks almost the same. Race and gender essentially disappear. 0.33, 0.321, 0.324, 0.347. Now let's look at coincidence scores. For white males, 0.731. For white females, 0.738. Now for blacks, 0.528. For black females, 0.531. Again, these differences are things that are not showing up in the correlations, but they do show up in the coincidence scores. Now, one more thing, and I keep an eye on the time. Yeah, okay. So another thing that you can do is you can do a full truth table analysis. I won't walk you through the whole analysis, but right now I've basically shown you descriptive. Now, what if we use an inferential approach? We can use a truth table algorithm. You know, happy to refer you to the relevant methodological readings on how you would do that. But in essence, you're creating a possibility space. You sort empirical cases into the rows of a table there. It's called the truth table. And then you minimize and simplify these expressions to pull out the underlying causal structure. And that gives you recipes associated with an outcome of interest. That's the super short version of how this works. So, all right. And what I'm showing you here is a representation of the findings for white males. What you see here is 4 different sets. This set over here, a favorable family background, means combining no income parents and educated parents, being educated yourself, not low test scores, and a favorable domestic situation, which we define as being married and not having kids. That's not favorable in general. That's just favorable if you want to avoid being in poverty. All right. So, and by the way, so that you run the analysis with 3 different consistency levels. That's a measure of sort of how much confidence you have that these are consistently associated with an outcome. 0.8, 0.8, 5.9, and the darker, so from yellow to orange to red, the higher the consistency. You can think about consistency as something vaguely parallel to a significance level in a regression, right? Like a p-score. All right, so what do we have? Well, the first thing is, if you're at the intersection of all 4 advantages, everybody's fine. But that's really not that interesting, right? Because if you have all advantages, basically race and gender disappear and everybody's going to be fine. But if you look at, there's 7 different recipes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different recipes or combinations that consistently avoid poverty. And for white males, you have, for instance, this recipe over here that only combines a favorable family background with being educated. Okay, so just 2 ingredients. You have also one down here, being educated and having a favorable domestic situation also leads you to avoid poverty consistently. And then you have 1, 2, 3, 4 recipes that combine 3 advantages, and you have 1 that combines 4. So 7 recipes altogether. Now let's take a look. What does the analysis for Black females show us? Because this was for white males. For Black females, it's a depressingly simple path. There's really only 3 paths to avoid poverty consistently. There's, of course, the path that combines all the advantages, but there's only 2 more paths, and both of them have at least 3 advantages. My point here is that it's kind of depressing how easy it is to predict poverty among Black females versus white males. But more importantly, all these differences, right? If you can think of these in a sense as a heat map, so to speak, right? You know, so how consistently do you avoid poverty? But there's just the diversity of pathways towards poverty avoidance for white males and not so much for Black females. Now, if you were to study, for instance, human resource management and you're interested in who ends up in executive positions, you could easily see how these tools would be helpful to understand what are the pathways that white males or white females would be taken versus minorities to become executives. Or if you were thinking about who gets venture capital funding as an outcome, you might think about gender or racial differences in that. Well, Silicon Valley tends to be very white, so it's going to be hard to find data on URM candidates there. But you get this is easily transferred to other areas, but it shows you things that otherwise you typically wouldn't be seeing. All right, I've gone now for, I think, a good 20-something minutes. I'll just give you a little bit of a teaser of some other stuff that's out there. This is something from an article that Yankee Park, Omar Sawi, and I published in MISQ. Set analytics have been more growing a lot in information systems research. So this was a 2020 MISQ piece. There's another JIS, Journal Association of Information System, we published in 2017. The point we're making here is that if the world was simple, one theory would explain everything, but the world isn't simple. So often you will need different theories. You might, for instance, have, if you want to explain corporate governance outcomes, you might have to combine things like agency theory and stewardship theory. And what we're saying here is often you'll have a situation where you might have different configuration that you observe, and they might map onto each other. There might be a high or a low degree of explanatory overlap. And then the question is how many configurations, or indeed, how many theoretical perspectives do you bring to the table? So up here in the top, you have sort of 2 theoretical perspectives, and they explain very different cases. Down here, you have 2 theoretical accounts that explain largely the same kinds of cases. And we applied that to a data set of corporate governance practices and looking at high-firm performance using Tobin's Q. The antecedents, so predictors we used were board composition, CEO duality, industry stage, maturity, how mature is the industry. You know, there's a year dummy here included, or CRISP set for year, because 1999 was sort of a really messed up year there. Organizational size and R&D intensity. If you've seen these tables, these configuration charts, you know how to read them. If not, I'll just tell you that Black circles indicate condition must be present. Crossed out circle indicates condition must be absent. Large circles are causally core conditions. Small circles are causal periphery conditions. Anyhow, and we generated 6 different configurations here. And it turns out this is a way to represent them in these Venn diagram of overlap. And you had sort of one configuration, C1 here, that was really associated logically with agency theory. And then you have several of them there. He was stewardship theory. And some of them are basically exhibit theoretical hybridity in that both mechanisms, you can have both the mechanisms of agency theory and the mechanisms of stewardship theory present in the same kind of cases, which of course is a situation of overdetermination, meaning sort of the outcome is overdetermined, 2 accounts provided, 2 mechanisms, if you will, lead to the outcome at present. And overdetermination, we're all familiar with from things like fail-safes, right? When you have multiple fail-safes to avoid, say, meltdown of a reactor, if one fail-safe doesn't kick in, the other one does. Those are, of course, situations of overdetermination. All right, so this was really meant as sort of a brief introduction to set analytics and QCA in particular, and I hope I sort of perked your interest in that. If you're interested in that further, I would recommend going to the fsqca.com homepage. You also get the free software package there, or you can go to the R package. If you want to know more, I recommend visiting the Compass webpage, Compass with 3 S's, that's by intention, for comparative small n studies, compass.org, or you can join QCA.net. At these days, I would almost recommend joining the FSQCA Facebook group, because Facebook is more active. That's where everybody is drifting there now. Also, if you want any of these connections, you can Google my name, Pierre Fiss, and it'll take you to my homepage. On my homepage, I have published all my publications, and I have also a lot of resources regarding QCA, as well as conference presentations and so forth. And all right, I'll stop now to leave some time for questions and to make sure we have also enough time for Louis to get to his work. Thank you so much.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Pierre. I appreciate it. So if you have any questions, please start typing in the chat. I do have a question myself. As you were speaking, these types of analyses reminded me of the analysis that we do in like micro research in terms of like person-centered approach, like profile analyses or cluster analyses. Are you familiar with any of those, and how do you actually compare? What kind of things that can be done differently with each of these approaches?
This is yeah, sure. Well, the traditional ways to look at configurations were cluster analysis, correlational analysis, and interaction effects. If you want the long explanation, I would refer to my 2007 article in AMR, where I lay out all those differences. So the short of it is that, look, cluster analysis just tells you what goes together, but it's not done. There's some folks actually in Zurich who are doing much better cluster analysis, but cluster analysis is not done relative to an outcome, right? It's done what looks similar to something else. So it doesn't answer what configurations lead to an outcome. Deviation scores do so, well, they're calculated relative to an ideal profile, and then you can use correlations or look at your deviation from the ideal type, but they once again are not created relative to an outcome. So neither of those approaches really do that. As for interaction effects, I think of interactions as an omnibus test for nonlinearity primarily. That's useful, but it doesn't give you recipes as much. And usually it tends to be limited to 2, maybe 3 interaction terms. With 3 interaction terms, I already have issues wrapping my head around it. With 4-way, 5-way interaction terms, I usually don't see published, and I don't know how to interpret them. But we're not really living in a world where only 2 things ever combine to bring about an outcome. That's a very simple world. I don't believe in that. With QCA, there is no multicollinearity because you don't have correlations. You're using Boolean algebra. So you could do, in principle, well, look, these are not interactions, but you can look at the relationships between like 8 or 10 different aspects without having to worry about interactiveness. So, all right, that's a short answer I would get referring to. I've been working on another piece. There's a couple of questions in the chat I see. Let me see, going through those. from Jonathan, right? You know, it's under the impression that QC allowed a researcher to determine set sufficiency. However, earlier you mentioned that QC allows a researcher to determine both sufficiency as well as necessity. Yes. Test for, you're true that truth table analysis, you're correct, the truth table analysis is primarily focused on what configurations, meaning what recipes are sufficient for an outcome, because that's what we usually are interested in. But you can use QC just as much to test for necessity using, you know, so actually if you go on the software package, there's a specific pull down menu that allows you to look at necessity and test for it. It's quite simple for that matter. It's simply looking at the consistency, whether your antecedent is a superset of the outcome, and then how far your scores actually agree with that relationship. So yes, that can be done. Jan Doel at Rotterdam has developed NCA, Necessary Condition Analysis, which I see as a complementary tool. But NCA, Necessary Condition Analysis, does not use sets. It uses variables. So it's not set analytic, it is correlational in that. Well, it's really partitioning variance and drawing sort of ceilings over variables. That's what it does. But I recommend it as a complementary tool. How did you see? Oh yeah, I already talked about that. So a couple of questions. Regard to the results in the quote-unquote heat map, how can similar representations of consistency be meaningful with a small n? Well, they can certainly be meaningful, except often with a small n. What you saw there was a large n analysis. And one of the reasons we used several consistency levels was that so much of the validity of your inference in large n analysis is carried by the proper application of the algorithm, as opposed to in small n analysis, if you have recourse to the cases, the validity of your inference is typically assured by your knowledge of the cases. You can go back to the cases. You could go back to the company, interview them again, and figure out whether what you're finding as a solution actually corresponds to what is happening in the organization and so forth. Or if you have data on countries and say innovation performance for countries, you could go back and sort of look at the literature for that country and figure out whether this solution makes sense or not. So often with small n situations, we will push up consistency quite high, maybe all the way to 1.0. If that's the case, you're quite right, then we wouldn't be looking at different consistency levels because we already have perfect consistency and there's no need to look at lower consistency levels. All right, let me keep looking at the questions in the chat. That's one. Second question, is QC been used to study organization level phenomena such as which employee leaves the company? Yes, absolutely. I would refer you to, now can I quickly change my screen again? I'm not going to take very long for this. So let me just pull up something up for you. I think it's going to make it easy. For instance, all right, okay, let me go back to screen sharing here and go here. All right, this is from my webpage, peerfist.com, and the publications. I'll show you some examples here. This article, the 2020 MISQ, looks at organizational level phenomena. The this one here, the 2016 one. This one here does so, as does the the most cited one tends to be my 2011 one. This looks at a sample of high technology organizations. You can apply this method really at the organization as well as at the. Sorry, yes.
You are sharing a different.
I was not
document.
sharing my. Sorry.
No, you were not sharing the website that you probably pulled from.
What was I sharing? My email or?
My one of my slides.
Oh,
That's great.
sorry,
Thank you.
Okay. Let me very briefly share my. Okay, let me correct my mistake then. Sorry, that was. See, Zoom always has a surprise for you. Especially, I'm traveling right now. I'm working with a setup of. Okay. Oh, yeah. I guess I see what you're saying. No, this one here. This one, that should be my website. Now, yeah, this one works? Okay, good. Yeah, that's my website. And yeah, I was referring to all the articles I posted there. So I was referring to this one here, the 2020 MISQ. I was referring to this one here, JIS. This is organizational abilities. This one's an organizational level. There's a whole bunch, and once again, Compass has a more complete list of all the studies, but you can apply this at the country level, at the organization level, at the individual level. Look, like regression, the level isn't really the issue of interest here. So, okay, all right. And I know, okay, I need to close things very briefly. Are there specific data requirements well, you can, can employment in different epistemological. Okay, it's a longer question. You could, if you have a variable, if you measure the variable, you can usually use it. Maximum number of cases, there is no maximum number of cases. You can do 1 million. Sample size can be large as you want to be, and that's it. All right. Okay, thank you so much for the opportunity to share this, and the RM division, much appreciated. Thank you, Tina. Thank you, Hoda. I'll shut up now.
Thank you so much, Pierre. Appreciate it. So we are a little bit short on time, so let's get right to the next presentation. Louis, do you want to start?
Yeah, great. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Thanks for inviting me. I got invited to present a big topic, which is big data analysis. So I really appreciate Tina and Pierre for giving me time, because this is a whole area. It's almost like talk about, advances in text analysis or something like that, and then go, right? So the way I've structured the presentation is, I was thinking about, junior scholars and grad students, really to have a high-level view of big data analyses, to recognize and understand some basic terminologies, so that you're prepared to consider the issues when reviewing and collaborating in this quote-unquote new field. So the key topics that I'll be covering today would be on big data and data science, some of the analytic techniques, and exactly how do people go about training machine learning models and how they are applied, and then some issues of consideration like bias and transparency. So big data and data science. So what is big data? Often you guys have probably heard, the 3 V's: volume, amount of data; variety, the different types of data; and velocity, which is just amount of data that you're constantly getting. Some people talk about 42 V's of big data, including, I don't know, veracity, value, maybe voodoo as one of the possibilities as well. Big data is also often thought of as organic data, and organic data meaning that these are not curated or developed for particular research purposes, but often come as part of a technological infrastructure, such as emails or tweets. So this can be a way to kind of think about big data. Often big data is also used synonymously with data science, which is really an interdisciplinary field that uses scientific methods to extract knowledge from data. Within organizational and psychological research, we often think of big data, when you think about the term big data, we think about really kind of newer types of data, which go beyond self-report surveys to actual quote-unquote behaviors, like using video data, maybe objective health data, like ambulatory assessments of heart rate, behavioral trace data, internet and internet usage, for instance, voice and text data. Or sometimes we think about big data as large-scale sources of behavioral data. So like internet searches, social media data, public cameras, and so forth. So I define big data really as multiplying multi-form data, whether it's structured or unstructured, organic types of data, the supporting technological infrastructure, and also the analytical techniques. So I think that it's very important for us as we kind of think about using the term big data to clarify what we are referring to, because it can refer to many aspects of it. It's an ambiguous term. We need to kind of think carefully about what we're saying. So in the following, I talk about big data with respect to the analytical techniques, which is referring to kind of big data analysis, where I kind of want to introduce some terms for us as we kind of think about this new field in organizational research. So due to the large volume of data, we often have to rely on computers to help select, sort, identify, really derive insights from the data that we have. Right? Previously, with smaller sets of data, we might be able to hand sort things, but now we are at a loss in terms of trying to deal with all the amount of data that's coming. So the first thing we want to kind of clarify is kind of what is, some of the basic terminologies that you often see thrown around, like AI, ML, deep learning. Basically, what we see here is, a subset of first having artificial intelligence, which is kind of this idea that machines can potentially achieve human-like intelligence, and that is kind of the broadest goal. Within that subset, we often talk about machine learning. So machine learning is really a subset of artificial intelligence. It's one way of achieving artificial intelligence, often within one specific domain or task, where computers learn models or patterns from the data rather than being explicitly programmed. So in traditional programming, a programmer actually defines the rules and rule base for actions. So for instance, if you program a chess game, traditionally you might say if white moves the pawn, to e4 at the start, then black should move the pawn to c5. Some kind of if-then kind of contingencies. But as you can see, it becomes really, really cumbersome because there are millions and millions of possible moves. So machine learning basically says, instead of doing that, we'll give the machines observations, and then the machines try to develop their own rules instead. So that's what machine learning is. Within that subset, there's deep learning, which is one type of machine learning algorithm using artificial neural networks with multiple layers. And I'll explain a little bit more about that, which is this idea of deep learning, where you have multiple layers. So one visualization of this can be found in Grant Sanderson's work. He has an excellent YouTube channel on this. He's really pedagogically gifted, and kind of the YouTube channel is here. So, think about this idea where you want to have a computer learn, quote unquote, handwritten numbers, right? So in this case, we might have a number 9, as you can see here, and this is like a 28 by 28 pixel where you have 784 individual pixels altogether. So this image can be kind of given into the first layer, what is called an input layer with multiple nodes, and we have 784 nodes here for each of the 784 pixels. And each of these pixels can have a value from 0 to 1. Think about this as a grayscale for the pixel, where 0 might be black and 1 might be white. And the numbers ranging kind of from 0 to 1 for different shades of gray. And then the goal is to have an output layer where the computer outputs the different probabilities of the numbers, whether it sees an image and it says, oh, this image is number 9, right? So it outputs, hopefully, says the probability of this being number 9 is 1. And the idea is that you have also different hidden layers in here, which is kind of the in-between, 2 in-between layers. And here we have kind of this idea where we have 16 nodes in each of these layers. And often you have fewer nodes in the hidden layers than the input layer, because what you're trying to do, again, this is kind of metaphorically, is to kind of create a way to partition this information into simpler pieces of information, what is called edges, and then maybe a pattern where you say, oh, okay, a 9 is when you have a loop on top and then a downstroke. And so that's kind of this idea of having the computer learn those edges and patterns. Almost always it's not interpretable. Like you actually hope that this is kind of what you see in terms of when you interpret the hidden layer, but you actually don't get that. And so it's often not interpretable. It almost looks like it's a random pattern. And that's why a lot of these neural networks are called black boxes. So given that we're also familiar with SEM, the idea is that giving lots of examples to the neural network, we can optimize the weights, which you can see here are kind of the lines here. Think of this as like factor loadings and also quote unquote biases, which in SEM terms might be referred to as thresholds, visualized by kind of connecting the nodes together. So that's really a simple or simplified view of deep learning, hopefully kind of demystifying this a little bit. But beyond deep learning, there are also a lot of machine learning algorithms that we see more and more within our journals now that I want to kind of draw your attention to. So there are different, quote unquote, different types of structures. On the top, you see kind of the equation-based structures where we have kind of the regression structure, which many of us are familiar with. We also have the rule-based or tree-based structure. And I was thinking about this when Pierre was presenting on QCA, where you have kind of, this idea of if this isn't here, then this is true, for instance. So kind of creating sets of information. We also have the naive Bayesian structure and then the neural network structure, which you guys have seen. So what you can see here is the kind of the visualization of it, where we can have the support vector machine acting like a regression structure. We can have decision trees, and then neural networks and kind of convolutional neural networks. So really, I won't be able to go through all of that in depth, but kind of just to let you see that there's a variety of ways in which we kind of think about machine learning models. So even something as simple as logistic regression is actually machine learning. So for those of you who know how to do regression, or logistic regression, you can call yourself AI or machine learning analyst, and you can market yourself as that. The other term that I want to kind of clarify is kind of supervised versus unsupervised learning. With supervised learning, you often present labeled data, quote unquote, to train your model. So labeled data are correct results, often referred to as ground truth. So it's the basis of supervised learning. So in the neural network example that I gave, we may provide all the images to the neural network with corresponding labels. So we might say, hey, the first image that you saw was a 9. The second image that I'm providing is a 5, and so forth. So it helps to train the model so that finally, when you give it quote unquote unlabeled data, which is just the raw images of a new data set, it's able to then tell you, oh, okay, this is most likely going to be a 5. This is most likely going to be a 6. That's how we kind of train it with labeled data. With unsupervised learning, or it's the idea of using unlabeled data, meaning that we actually don't give any sort of labels to the data. We're just asking the machine learning models to detect patterns in the data in an inductive fashion. So think about this in terms of exploratory factor analysis as an analog to unsupervised learning. You provide the computer a set of responses to the scale items, and it seeks to figure out how scale items are clustered together to reveal some sort of underlying structure. And semi-supervised learning is really kind of a merge between supervised and unsupervised learning, where a small portion of the data is labeled and lots of data are unlabeled. So that's also important for us to think about as we kind of talk about these terms like supervised learning and unsupervised learning. A lot of what we see in the literature right now is in terms of supervised learning, where we provide labeled data and then we train the machine learning models based on that. There are lots of contexts to use machine learning models. In current organizational and psychological research, machine learning models are typically used in these conditions. One is, as we've kind of alluded to, the use of unstructured data. So like when you have text or videos or kind of organic data, which are not curated for a particular purpose, right? You're actually gathering a lot of all this information and trying to process this data and analyze it. The other aspect where machine learning models are used too is often when we have many predictors, resulting in the case of P much greater than N. P referring to parameters to be estimated, and N referring to number of participants or data points. So for instance, if we want to use language in tweets to predict personality, the number of unique words that we see in all these tweets will often be much more than the participants. And so if each unique word is used to predict a participant characteristic, we have a situation where, let's say, if you run it in a regression model, where the number of parameters for each word predicting like personality would be a lot, way more than what we have in terms of the participants themselves. The other aspect too with machine learning models is that we can model nonlinearity or interactivity. So we can move beyond the assumptions of a linear relationship with inputs and outputs. So for instance, some machine learning algorithms can actually distinguish between clusters of data. So in terms of really crazy data, like what we see here on the left column, just using a regression approach, we can actually distinguish the points between the blue and the red points. However, with using machine learning models, for instance, on the far right, by using support vector machine learning model, you can actually distinguish between these two sets of data by performing nonlinear transformations of the data. And so you can actually model that nonlinearity and interactivity that is not easily done with traditional methods. The idea too of using machine learning models, as we've mentioned, is we want computers, right, to be some sort of AI being able to perform human tasks. So we want to train these models to really go beyond the research data that we have, right, to actually be able to then say, how can we use these models to, for instance, in a practical setting, in the IO/OB setting, we might say we want it to automatically score resumes, or we want it to automatically score interviews, or even automatically score, let's say, talks that people give. How good of a talk is it, right? Without actually having human raters. So having machines take that over. And so in that regard, with machine learning, it's very, very important to kind of think about this idea of generalizability. And one way of that machine learning models or this kind of big data analytic approach deals with this is through what we call cross-validation. And in traditional validation, and many of us are familiar with, is that we want to look at how generalizable is our model, right? So maybe we randomly split our data in terms of 80% of the data, we call it calibration data, and we fit it to our model, like the best fitting CFA model we might find. And then we then use the best fitting CFA model to fit into the validation data to see whether the fit is still reasonable. So the problem, though, in this approach is that the model is not validated across the entire data set, right? We're only using 20%. So in machine learning, what they say, hey, let's try a more optimal approach. And you'll often hear this term, K-fold cross-validation. Don't be afraid of it. It's really just an extension of the regular cross-validation or traditional validation approach, where now you say, okay, I'm going to train my machine learning model on the training set, where you kind of randomly, in this way, sorry, before that, I should say, K-fold cross-validation is just a number of folds or number of parts that you're splitting your data into. So in this case, if I say a 5-fold cross-validation, that means I have 5 different sets or 5 different random sets that I'm splitting my data into. I have the training set, which is 4 out of 5. And then in this case, we train the model on 4 folds and then test it in the 5th fold. And then we run this through 5 times. So in that way, this approach is more optimal than the traditional holdout method. And you will often see this being used. And if it's not being used, you should use it when you're applying machine learning models. In our recent paper in Current Directions, and I won't go through this too deeply, the idea is that you can use machine learning models in a lot of different settings in terms of different sensing modalities, from biological all the way to kind of social and different kind of contexts as well, as you can see in the columns, and both in the lab and also online too. So really I think the only constraint of using kind of big data analysis is your creativity and maybe what are the available data sets that you can access. The other thing that I often notice when I'm kind of editing or reviewing papers in ORM or JAP is that people often confound or confuse this term measurement versus prediction within kind of big data analysis. So the idea is that, by leveraging big data, we can start using all these different forms of data and advanced analytical techniques to measure individual and organizational constructs. And I kind of give some examples here in PLOS One, JAP as well, where people are using machine learning models to do things like, how do we assess personality? How do we assess things like work experience from job application forms, for instance? And the endeavor of measurement is really kind of thinking about putting numbers on abstract phenomena, which are our constructs, right? And we want to scale individuals on some kind of common numeric metric. Another way of viewing measurement is the use of data to infer some kind of attribute for the individual, organization, or society. So with big data measurement, what we have is we have raw data where we then convert them into features which are usable by the computer. So for instance, raw data might be video, voice, text. And then we want to extract some kind of representation in terms of what the computer can use. This is known as feature computation. And then we use some kind of inferential procedure, which is kind of the what we call the algorithmic structures that I presented earlier, to create a model and create estimates of the parameters, such as regression rates. However, machine learning models use different features within the jargon to predict the construct of things. So we often use machine learning models to measure something, but then within the machine learning model jargon is the idea that we're using these features to predict the construct of interest. but the ultimate goal is really to measure those constructs. Visually, you might look at this this way, where we have extracted features from, let's say, in terms of a video interview. And then we might provide ground truth to say, this is actually personality. And we want to assess personality, which is the psychological construct. Machine learning models are basically using these features to predict the ground truth. But the ground truth is really a proxy for predicting psychological constructs of interest. So we're actually a lot of times using machine learning models to measure something, not quote unquote predict something per se, as we would normally say it within OB and psychology, where we use constructs of interest, whether measured by machine learning or traditional methods, to predict outcomes. So I think that's a very important clarification when we review papers and also when we kind of think about it in terms of machine learning models. I want to keep things fairly short, so I will probably just run through only a few things here in terms of the machine learning models part. You can refer to this information in terms of how machine learning models are actually being trained and applied. There is first the data preparation part, where then you kind of obtain your raw data, you prepare it in terms of pre-processing, and then you submit it to kind of this training and testing, which I kind of mentioned in terms of the K-fold cross-validation. You select the best performing model. If it's satisfactory, you can deploy it on new data. If it's not, you iterate it again. So with regard to data preparation, you often want to validate it. You want to featureize it, meaning that you want to convert your raw data into machine learning features. You select the relevant features, especially ones that are highly correlated, and then you might normalize those features as well to place them on a common scale. I won't go through the nested cross-validation, but what I do want to say is that in model building itself, we often need to think about this term called hyperparameters. This term is often thrown around in machine learning models. A parameter is what is estimated from the data. I think all of us are very familiar with that, like beta coefficients in the regression. However, a hyperparameter is specified by the researcher, and there's a range of values that can help improve prediction. It's external to the data, and the example, kind of returning back to the neural networks approach, is the number of hidden nodes in a neural network. The researcher might specify, I want 5 hidden nodes, or I want 10 hidden nodes, or I want 15 hidden nodes. So as you're doing model selection, you're also trying out these different hyperparameters as well. And in different algorithms, there are different types of hyperparameters. And I'll share these slides so you guys can take a look, but I won't go into too much detail. What you want to know is that in terms of selecting or tuning these hyperparameters, you probably will also need to do not just K-fold cross-validation, but nested cross-validation, where within the training data set, you even split it up into training and validation, and you try out different models with different hyperparameters, and you validate it, and you iterate it X number of times, depending on how many folds you have. The other issues for consideration, and I want to wrap up in maybe just 5 more minutes, is that here the big issues at the forefront of kind of data science, machine learning, big data. The biggest one is really bias and fairness, which I think a lot of organizational researchers can contribute to. And with kind of machine learning, one of the things that we've, as I mentioned, often use machine learning for is for measurement. And so a lot of the work that we've done in terms of measurement bias can be applied here in machine learning. And we want to think about machine learning measurement bias in terms of differential functioning of trained machine learning models between subgroups. It can manifest when we get different predicted score levels for individuals belonging to different subgroups based on race or gender, despite them having the same ground truth level, like personality. So you might have 2 groups of individuals, you know that the personality levels are the same, but then when you run your machine learning models, you get 2 different scores, right? So different prediction levels, or it might be differentially predictive. across these, or different predictive accuracies across these groups. It's very helpful for, I think, when you get into the field and collaborate with computer scientists or review papers, to start thinking about machine learning measurement bias. One is in terms of data bias. As I've kind of alluded to, a lot of these machine learning models are based on some kind of labeled data or ground truth data. And so your machine learning models are only as good as your ground truth. So often it's all kind of hidden in that. They'll say, oh, I reran these fancy models, you know, and then you get blinded by the shiny thing. But really it's all based on, wait, actually, how good are the survey data or the ground truth data that is being used to kind of create these models? Or for instance, the raters might be biased in the first place when rating the videos. And so then that propagates throughout the entire system. So that's a very important piece to kind of think about in terms of data bias leading to machine learning measurement bias. And I won't go through all of that. The other thing to note is that sometimes when you use feature computations, so like automatic speech recognition, they actually are less precise for perhaps internationals because they have certain dialects that the majority group speech might not work as well, because these machine learning algorithms were trained on majority groups, not on minority groups. So we need to also examine the features computed for possible biases as well. The other aspect is algorithm training bias, which is kind of the link between the features and the ground truth. We might actually be creating different types of algorithms for different subgroups. And so in some ways, actually creating two different rulers to measure different subgroups. Because if the algorithms, like you're saying, oh, we're using two different regression equations, right, to predict for two different groups, like men versus women, you're actually creating a type of bias, possibly. So I think that's also important to note. In terms of transparency, as I mentioned, you know, often people get blinded by something that is shiny and new in terms of machine learning, but we need to think about how are kind of the basics done, right? We want people to report, for instance, how are features actually obtained from different modes of data. This is an example of text data where Louis Hickman, you know, published this in ORM, looking at kind of what are the processes for dealing with text, because there's so many different possibilities that you can actually approach how you process that information. That a lot of it can be lost in translation, or it's not replicable even. So we need more directions for other types of data that I think will be very helpful for the field, and I think could be very competitive for, you know, or not competitive, but I think would be very suitable for ORM, for instance. We're trying to provide a resource for researchers to be able to do that. And then also thinking about how to create more replicable findings. We want to report on not just the source of the data, but the pre-processing techniques, the software that is being used. We want to avoid manual data manipulation. We also want to provide the rationale as well. So it's not just in terms of qualitative, but it's also in terms of quantitative data, as we've kind of talked about. And then we also want to be able to test whether some of these results are generalizable. So I want to thank all my collaborators who have contributed to this work. And I'm also very grateful for the John Templeton Foundation, National Science Foundation, and SciOp that's helped with my research on machine learning measurement and also measurement bias as well. So I'll open this time for Q&A.
Thank you very much, Luis. Really appreciate it. And sorry you had to rush through your presentation today. So
no, it's all good.
Yeah, thank you. So if you have any question, please start typing it in the chat, or if you want to ask it directly, you can just raise your hand. I just want to ask him like a more of practical question, like what kind of software do you actually use to do some of your analyses? Maybe probably you're using multiple ones.
Yeah, so in terms of if you're an R user, there are a lot of good packages that can be used. So for instance, like Carrot, which is classification and regression training. It helps do kind of the data splitting, some of the pre-processing of the data, and also kind of with the resampling and some of the K-fold cross-validation. So that is good. Another one that if you're into kind of visualization, you could use ggplot, which is something that I use a lot. So I think that's also another good one. There are others as well, like Data Explorer and dplyr. So those are the ones that you can explore. But really, I think there's a lot of tools out there. So not just in R, but in other types of software environments. That's a great question.
Perfect. Thank you. So does anyone have any question or about this one or about Tina's presentation? So we have a couple of minutes at the end. Dr. Fitz had to leave us a little bit early because of another commitment that he had. But if you have any question, you can just type it in the chat. If not, I'd like to thank you both for coming in today and taking the time. I know, Tina, you're traveling, and Louis, thank you so much. So we really great. I'm sure the participants have greatly benefited from your talk and your presentation. And yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Hoda, for organizing this, and great seeing
Thank
everyone.
you.
Good seeing you, Tina.
Yeah. So thanks, everyone. See you all next week.